remember watching Sesame Street? Probably you do. It's really an American classic and has been around for a long time. We can relate to Big Bird and the other characters that were on Sesame Street. But Sesame Street is more than just a kids program. We've learned some very critical things from it. The first is that if young people are really going to learn, they need to experience something. They need to have an experiential learning. And in after school, we are all about experiential learning, creating experiences so that kids can make meaning of the experience itself. The second thing that we learned from Sesame Street was the real importance of debriefing, of talking about the learning. When we have young kids who sit and watch Sesame Street for a half an hour, and then they simply go on and play by themselves or with another child, and nobody really talks to them about that, we find that the child's learning is far less than if someone spends 3 to 4 minutes talking to them about what they learned on Sesame Street. So this two-part learning experience, experiencing it and then debriefing it, having participated and then talking about the learning are incredibly important. So I'd like to invite you to listen in on a class for site coordinators that has to do with the importance of experiential learning and debriefing. Welcome to a class for site coordinators on the importance of experiential learning and debriefing. Experiential learning is based on a premise that if you experience something yourself, you will create a far different meaning at a much deeper level than if somebody simply tells you about it or lectures you on that topic. After School has embraced this whole concept of experiential learning because what we would like to do is have young people understand how academic learning applies in the real world. And that is really at the heart of experiential learning. Experiential learning requires that the participant is active. They cannot just passively sit there and have the input come in. In other words, you don't lift their head open and pour it in. They actually have to be hands-on and participatory, and that way they, like every other student, is having an experience around the learning. So in after school, what's important is that we find a way to create common experiences. One of the ways that we can do that is through project-based learning, and a second way is through disguised learning. Disguised learning is very much like project-based learning with one exception. Disguised learning usually happens in a single day. It's a single activity, a single experience that young people will have, whereas a project will last over time and will allow the young person to have a wide variety of learning experiences that they will debrief and then stack one on top of the other to develop real understanding. Both project-based learning and disguised learning allow young people to really become engaged with the material. It gives them opportunities to explore their own learning, to not just have one thing happen and then that's the end of it. They get to keep trying things out and exploring, and through that exploration learn. The other really important thing about project-based learning or disguised learning is that it has the 3 R's of after school included. It's relational. Usually young people are working in small groups or at least with a partner. It is rigorous. There is something to learn that they have not yet experienced or mastered. And finally, it is relevant. It is something that they are interested in and that they want to learn more about. So when we have disguised learning opportunities or project-based learning opportunities that contain or have taken into consideration these 3 R's, relationships, rigor, and also relevance, we are far more likely to have young people who are willing participants in the learning. So what happens is that in one lesson or a series of lessons, young people have certain experiences. And all of those are wonderful. But if we want to take those experiences and change them into a learning opportunity, then it is essential that we debrief. Debriefing is helping the young person think about the learning, to think about the thinking, in other words. Metacognition, which is technically what thinking about thinking is something that no other primate does. It is something that is unique to human beings, where they stop and reflect and learn, not just by rote doing it over and over, but by actually consciously thinking about the learning. Debriefing allows us to do that in a way that nothing else does. Debriefing helps young people connect the dots. It also helps you to listen in on how they're connecting the dots in their mind, so that you can help them and guide them to connect them in ways that make sense. I'd like for you to think about your mind as a large closet pole. If you were to buy a new green shirt to go with your navy blue pants, and you were to hang that shirt on a hanger and put it on this closet, you might hang it right next to the navy blue pants because that's what you bought the shirt to go with. By accident, you might see that that same green shirt fits wonderfully well with your plaid pants or your khaki pants or your white pants. When you do that, you have learned more about that green shirt than you originally had planned. That activity has helped you to experience the green shirt in a different way. So if then that activity is debriefed and we talk about what you learned and you say, hey, what I learned is that my green shirt might go with 3 or 4 different pairs of pants, and we talk about how that might impact your decision making and impact the way that you select what you're going to wear, then we have now taken this experience and created real learning from it. Let's talk about 3 different ways that you might debrief. One is very simple, and it's usually a good place to start because young people oftentimes don't want to tell you what they didn't like. Or they only want to tell you what they didn't like, and they never really want to get what was good. So it's called LBNT, liked best next time. So in this debrief, you ask young people, what did you like best or learn most from in the activity that we just did? And you make a list of those things. Well, I really liked the fact that we got to work with the science experiment hands-on. I really liked the fact that I got to work with my partner so closely so that I didn't have to do it all by myself. Whatever it is that they say. Then you ask them, what would you like to have more of? That we did this time, but you really would have appreciated more of in the future. And they may say, well, it would have really been better had we had a little more time. We really got rushed there at the end because we had to clean up, so we would really like a little more time. Now, that informs you about what worked for the young people, what they learned. It also helps them to think about the experience themselves and to also make a recommendation about how that might be improved. That's one way to deepen the learning. A second way that you might want to do that is with the question, what's important about that? Now, this is a question that needs to be asked very carefully, and then you need to very carefully listen to the student's response, because you will ask this question, what's important about that, 2 or 3 times to take the student's learning deeper and deeper. So, for instance, we have done an activity where we've gone out and cleaned up the playground and orchestrated the lost and found items of clothing. And we're going to debrief that activity. It was our community project that we agreed to work on, and now I want to debrief that with the students. So my first question would be, and I would select one student to ask the question of, what is important about making the playground neat and orderly, and also organizing the clothing that was in the lost and found box? When a student volunteers, I select the student and I listen to the answer. So maybe the student says, well, it's really important because the playground was a mess, and it's not much fun to play out there when it's a mess, and it also, when we folded up all those clothes, now people can see what it is that they left. So I, as the listener, the asker of the question, I'm not going to go to another student. I'm going to stick with this one student, and I'm going to take from what they said and ask a follow-up question. So when I think about their answer, I think that what I heard them say is that it was important to make things easier for other students to access. So I would ask my second, what's important about that question, by saying, well, what's important about playing a role in making things easier for other students to access, to be able to find the clothes more quickly, to have things orderly on the playground. And then I will listen again for the young person's answer. Perhaps they'll say, well, it's really important because sometimes as the older kid, it's easier for us to do it, and then it'll really help out the younger kids because they're the ones who struggle. So I listen to that, and I decide that maybe what I want to follow up on is, why is it important for people with a greater number of skills to help people with a lesser number of skills, like you do for younger children? So I would ask that question, and I would say, what's important about, as an older person, learning to help a younger person who has less skills than you do? And then I would hear their answer. I probably wouldn't go deeper than 3 times, but what you'll discover is that you'll get much more to what's important about the activity. What's really important about that activity, the young person may tell me, is that it builds their confidence when they are able to help people to find the things that they need, and it also builds the confidence of the younger student as well. So the real importance of the activity of straightening the playground and organizing the clothing in the lost and found is that it helps to build confidence in everybody involved. So asking the question, what's important about that, can help you to really zero in on what's important. But it's also equally important for you to pay close attention to what the student is saying, so that your question follows up on the statement that they made. A third way that you can debrief is called DIGA, D-I-G-A, and that stands for 4 separate questions that, or opportunities to think, that you will engage the young people in. The first one is D, which is describe. And what you're asking of young people to do is simply describe what they just did. I love to do this in a heads together, where you have 2 young people talking to one another, or it's absolutely possible for one young person to talk for the whole group. But in the first part of DIGA, the D, they are simply describing what is. The I in DIGA stands for interpret. During the interpret phase of DIGA, what you are asking the young person to reflect on is their key learning. You are asking the question, what was your key learning in this activity, and listening to their response. Another thing that you might ask in the I interpret is, what skills did they use in order to participate in this activity? So if it's more of a skills-based activity, or if it's one that you want them to interpret in a way that they're reflecting on the learning and what was key to them, you might ask both of those questions, or one or the other. The G of DIGA stands for generalize. And what you are going to ask the student to do is to generalize this key learning, or this key acquisition of skills, to the world as a whole. And you might ask the question, so how do you see yourself using that learning in your life? How do you see that happening? And then giving them an opportunity to answer. Or how do you see yourself using the skills that were required in this activity in your life? So let's generalize. The last part of DIGA, the A, is apply. And the question is simply this: how will you take the skills that you learned today and apply them tomorrow? Or how will you take the key learning from today and apply it tomorrow? So DIGA stands for describe, what did you do? Interpret, talk about the key learning or the skills that were required. Generalize, generalizing the skills or the key learning. And finally, A, apply the key learning or the skill set. When you do those activities with kids, one of those 3 debriefs, you've allowed them to go deeper in their own understanding so that it is truly about a learning opportunity, not just an experience. Every day, in every lesson, take time to debrief. Ultimately, you would like for the kids to lead the debrief themselves. When they can do that, you know for sure that they have begun to think about each of the activities they do and turn them into a learning opportunity.